I really think that, Arn Ra, you've said some powerful things tonight. And there's one thing that you've said that I really am curious about. You've had some of these experiences, namely in dealing with other people in the form of Christianity. Is that correct?
That is true, yeah.
Yeah. Can you describe some of those? Because I didn't know that about you. You're a very honest person. I always love having you on the show, and I simply like to give context to various kinds of theology. I believe very little, that is, of the spin on theology. I like researching theology, I like exploring theological considerations, but when it comes to belief, that's tough. But can you share a bit?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I've given it in a couple of presentations. I mean, this is the primary difference between myself and the other performers in the Unholy Trinity, for example. I mean, most of the people that you would meet on the apostate circuit are going to be former fundamentalist Christians or what have you. I was a Christian at one point, but I was never a fundamentalist. I believed primarily because my parents and my babysitters and other such people around me were telling me that God is a conclusively proven scientific fact and was beyond question, and that things were questioning the existence of God was as ridiculous as questioning whether we really had a president or whether it was just all a puppet government with nobody really in charge. Later on, as a teenager, I actually had that reborn thing where you recommit yourself to Christ or what have you. And I remember I was 19, and a friend of mine who is now a fundamentalist minister in a creationist school in Fort Worth, Texas. Back then, he was priming for that gig, and he got me, or he was involved in this rebirth experience that I had, and I remember it was like an overwhelming, dizzying kind of euphoria, and it was a very profound experience. And I remember trying to coming to my senses in a few hours and asking him, "How do I know that this is really real? That everything what I'm feeling, and that I haven't just manufactured this? How do I know that this is a real thing?" And this is an important question. If you care about understanding reality, then the only important thing, it doesn't matter what you want to believe. All that's important is what you can show to be true. And so he grabbed me by both of my shoulders and he smiled at me with this huge grin and said, "Just keep telling yourself it's Jesus until you believe it." And that was the most dishonest thing I'd ever heard come out of his mouth. And to know that Christianity was represented with that's what faith meant was the absolute destruction of religious belief for me. Where, in a sense, I was that was the last instant as a Christian. And I later on I moved into a neo-pagan sort of a thing where I thought you would try direct experience experimentation, and my misguidance there was that I was still using faith, I just didn't know it. Where if the neo-pagan spiritualists try to get yourself to see just beyond what your physical eyes are capable of, to read auras or what have you, close your eyes, turn off your mind, and float downstream, and you start realizing, like sense deprivation or whatever, that you're going to enhance your consciousness and perceive things beyond what your physical senses can do. In other words, you're making shit up. You just don't realize that, and you're starting to look for any kind of pattern to establish things that aren't really there. And I remember, among other experiences, I saw a figure appear to me in a night of great meditation and long periods of concentration. A figure appeared to me in the room that was basically made out of heat distortion. You ever seen like when heat you see heat distortion, how it changes things? Well, it
Right.
seemed to be like that in a cutout of a human figure. So I'm imagining that I'm seeing a real person there. And I was convinced at the time that I'm really looking at something. I was convinced of things like experiencing astral projection, both in seeing astral projectionists appear in these kinds of manifestations, and also of astral travel myself. I was convinced of a number of spectral manifestations that I actually saw, and was convinced that the other people with me had seen and experienced these things too. And it took decades of holding on to these personal experiences and remembering them vividly as things that are in, a room full of gargoyles, combat with spiritual beings, these sorts of things, to realize, eventually, to realize that that couldn't really happen. And yet I remember that it did happen. And I know simultaneously that it didn't happen. It's a very hard thing to realize that you have these deep, moving personal experiences that blew everybody else's Christian experience right out of
Yeah.
the water. I mean, my experience was way more dramatic than anything they ever experienced, and I held on to that, and a number of pseudoscientific frauds that I foolishly believed because I was a subject of the American media. And I was told that there was all kinds of scientific evidence for spiritual life force, for psionics, for telekinesis, and remote viewing and all of this, because they'll put anything on TV, call it a science documentary, and it
Right.
doesn't matter how fraudulent it is. And so I was a gullible kid in the 70s, and I just bought this. And eventually, I realized that that experience that I had, if true, would create a huge series of paradoxes to the point that it couldn't be true, and that the only reasonable experience was that both I and the other person that was sharing that experience with me must both have hallucinated this, because it can't have really happened. And so eventually, through the power of the internet, I connected with that person again. It was somebody that I hadn't talked to in decades. But there's all kinds of ways that you can connect with people that you knew back in high school and so forth. And I met this person and somebody else that was involved in another one of my spiritual adventures. And surprisingly, both of them, although they were heavy into like druidic magic or transcendental meditation or whatever back at that time. Now, when I get in touch with them again, both of them are just in the same position that I am. They're hardcore rationalists. They don't believe anything on faith. They don't believe in any kind of supernatural or psionic anything. And when I talk about these experiences, which I remember them experiencing with me, neither of them remember those events at all.
Wow.
So I'm completely in the dark. I'm like, I remember vividly an experience we shared that was dramatic and explosive, and that went on for hours, and there were no drugs involved, because I've never been into drugs. And so I just have no explanation other than when you psych yourself up for something, when you get involved in the ambiance and you really want to believe, you really can manufacture that illusion. And I found that I was doing that as a neo-pagan occultist practitioner. I was doing that for other people. In the early 80s, it was a great way to pick up chicks. Honestly, I mean, it was a great way to really to get somebody involved in something what they would be interested in. And I found that I could convince anybody to see or hear or experience anything they already believed, if they already believed it. You're never going to convince a Christian to see Krishna, or a Krishna to see, or a Hindu to see Jesus. It's not going to work that way. But if they already believe it, you can work on that. And if they want to believe it, you can make them experience, audibly, visually, however you like, anything they already into, because they want it that bad. And when you build up the music, the drums, the incense, whatever is involved in the ambiance of that, you can manufacture all these illusions. And when I realized that I was actually manufacturing illusions for people rather than getting them to really experience something that was real, it occurred to me how dishonest that was. But then the instant later, you realized it had a mirror effect, that I was actually doing that to myself. I had demonstrations that I could give people to show them the truth of the psychic energy in the palms of your hands, for example. And when I realized that I was actually manufacturing an illusion in my own mind and then presenting it to other people as if it was real. And it all collapsed. And so when anybody else tells me about their religious experience, I mean, like when I read about George Harrison, for example, who he chances the mantras to Krishna, repeatedly until he says he can see Krishna actually appear in the room. He can see him, he can hear him, he can talk to him, he can laugh at him. It's just like there's a real person really there. And John Lennon was buying into the same thing too. They're both professing the same thing. You tell that to any Christian, and the Christian won't have a visual apparition of Jesus to talk to. But even though they have this tiny little imperceptible thing they're imagining in the back of their head, and they're calling that talking to Jesus, they automatically discard George Harrison and John Lennon and all of the other Hindus, the Bhakti Hindus, for having this more direct,
Right.
more vivid experience of their God. I also met a pagan who, somebody I'd known for decades, who adopted a belief in Bast, the Egyptian cat-headed goddess, because she manifested herself in his house, where he could see her. And she gives him a hug and begs that he become her disciple, which of course he did, because, when does Jesus ever like physically show up and shake your hand and say, "Hi, I'm Jesus"? And you know, you know. So I listened to all these other religions, and probably the best one was when, in 1981, I read this thing from Thailand where this girl was talking about how she had this huge elation, this huge overwhelming experience. It was exactly like my rebirth experience, where she said that she had this dizzying euphoria, where she's like light on her feet, and for hours everything is fantastic, and all of her troubles just melted away the moment she accepted Buddha into her life. And it was almost verbatim what I had heard people describe about Jesus. So I realized there's not any truth to any one belief over any other. In fact, all these other beliefs have psychic energies and faith healing practices and a whole bunch of other evidences that they'll claim that is way beyond what Christians will claim. And I think I'll